Welcome. Tonight, we travel to a different kind of journey, not across continents, but through a single catastrophic moment and its aftermath. Settle in comfortably now, and allow your breathing to find its natural rhythm. There is nothing urgent here, only the slow unfolding of a story that happened more than a century ago in a city by the bay. San Francisco in early 1906 was a jewel of the American West, a sophisticated, cosmopolitan metropolis known as the Paris of the West. Its streets climbed steep hills lined with Victorian mansions and busy commercial buildings. Cable cars chimed their bells as they carried bankers, merchants, and workers up and down the city's dramatic slopes. The waterfront bustled with ships from across the Pacific. Opera houses and theaters offered evening entertainment to a population that had grown wealthy from gold, silver, and trade. But San Francisco sat on unstable ground, built over filled marshland, and perched along one of the world's great geological boundaries. At dawn on April 18, 1906, the earth beneath the city would shift violently, and in the space of less than a minute, thousands of lives would change forever. What followed was not just an earthquake, but 3 days of fire, a massive refugee crisis, and a reconstruction effort that would reshape the city with remarkable speed. Over the next hours, we will move through 4 phases of this story. First, you will experience the earthquake and fires themselves, the terrifying shaking, the scramble to escape collapsing buildings, the helplessness as flames consumed block after block. Then we will observe the refugee crisis and recovery, the tent cities and relief efforts that kept 250,000 people alive in the ruins. We will step aside to understand the science, how this disaster helped geologists unlock the secrets of earthquakes and fault lines. And finally, we will walk through the lost city itself, the elegant, flawed, vibrant San Francisco that existed before dawn on that April morning, and the remarkable speed with which it was rebuilt. Let the images come gently. There is no need to hold them tightly. You are safe here, observing from a distance, as we walk slowly through smoke and rubble, through tent cities and reconstruction, through a moment when one of America's great cities was unmade and remade in a matter of months. Let us begin. Imagine yourself asleep in a tenement building in the south of Market District of San Francisco. The date is April 18, 1906. The time is just after 5 in the morning. The sky outside your window is beginning to lighten, that pale gray that comes before dawn. The streets are quiet. Most of the city is still sleeping. You lie on a thin mattress in a small room, perhaps sharing the space with family members or other lodgers. The air is cool, carrying the faint salt smell of the bay a few blocks away. At precisely 5:12 a.m., you wake to a sensation unlike anything you have felt before. The building begins to shake. At first, it might seem like a heavy wagon passing in the street, but within a second or two, the shaking intensifies dramatically. The floor beneath you is moving, not just vibrating, but heaving, rolling, as if the earth itself has become liquid. You try to stand, but the motion throws you down. The walls groan and crack. Plaster rains from the ceiling in chunks and clouds of white dust. The noise is overwhelming, a deep rumbling from below, mixed with the crash of falling objects, the splintering of wood, and the screams of neighbors. For 45 to 60 seconds, the ground continues its violent motion. To those experiencing it, the time feels much longer. Some survivors would later say it seemed like 5 minutes or more, though it was less than 2. The shaking comes in waves. Just when you think it might be ending, another powerful jolt knocks you flat. You crawl toward the doorway, or perhaps toward a family member, your hands scraping across a floor covered in debris. Outside, through the broken window, you hear the crash of bricks hitting the street, the shriek of twisting metal, the thunder of entire buildings collapsing. When the shaking finally stops, the silence that follows is brief and eerie. Then the screaming begins in earnest human voices, calling for help, for family members, for God. You manage to stand, your legs unsteady, and look around. Your room is barely recognizable. Furniture has toppled and slid across the floor. The door frame is twisted. Cracks run up the walls like lightning. You can see daylight through gaps in the ceiling and walls where there should be none. The smell hits you next gas, strong and acrid, leaking from broken pipes throughout the building. You know instinctively that you must leave, and quickly. You grab what you can, perhaps a coat, a pair of shoes, but there is no time for more. Others are already pushing toward the stairwell. A chaotic mass of people in night clothes, some injured and bleeding, some carrying children. The stairs are damaged, sagging and cracked, but they hold as you descend. Outside in the street, the scene is one of utter devastation. Buildings that stood 4 or 5 stories tall are now piles of brick and splintered timber. Others lean at impossible angles, their facades sheared away to reveal the rooms inside like a dollhouse split open. People wander in shock, some still in their nightclothes, some bleeding from cuts caused by flying glass and debris. A woman sits on the curb, rocking back and forth, holding a child. A man digs frantically at a pile of rubble, calling a name over and over. The south of Market District, where you live, is a working-class neighborhood of wooden tenements and boarding houses, built quickly and cheaply to house the city's laborers, longshoremen, and factory workers. Many of these structures were already in poor condition before the earthquake. Now, dozens have collapsed entirely. You can hear muffled cries from beneath the rubble, people trapped in the wreckage. Some neighbors attempt rescues, lifting beams and pulling away bricks with their bare hands. Others simply stand and stare, their minds unable to process what has happened. Within minutes, a new danger emerges. Smoke. You notice it first as a gray haze rising from several points across the neighborhood. Then you see the flames, small at first, but growing quickly. The earthquake has toppled stoves and lamps in thousands of homes. Broken gas lines are feeding the fires. And the city's water mains, you will soon learn, have been shattered by the quake. The firemen, when they arrive, will connect their hoses to hydrants and find nothing but a trickle, or nothing at all. Imagine standing in that street, watching as fire after fire springs up around you. The flames find plenty to feed on wooden buildings, furniture, fabric, paper. They spread from one structure to the next, leaping across narrow alleys, climbing up walls, consuming everything. The heat becomes intense. You back away, then turn and begin walking, joining a growing stream of refugees moving away from the flames. Throughout the morning, the fires multiply and merge. What began as dozens of separate blazes becomes a single massive firestorm. The smoke rises in a towering column, visible for miles. Ash begins to fall like snow, covering everything in a gray film. The air tastes of smoke and dust. Your throat burns. Your eyes water. You tie a handkerchief over your nose and mouth, but it offers little relief. The city's firefighters work heroically, but they are fighting a losing battle. With the water mains broken, they are reduced to using water from the bay, from cisterns, from any source they can find, but it is not nearly enough. In desperation, city and military officials decide to create fire breaks by dynamiting buildings in the path of the flames. The idea is to remove fuel and stop the fire's advance. But the men doing the work are not trained demolition experts. They use too much explosive or place it poorly, and the results are often counterproductive. Buildings explode into clouds of flaming debris that drift on the wind and start new fires blocks away. The thunderous booms of dynamite add to the nightmare atmosphere constant, reminders that the disaster is ongoing and escalating. You walk west, then north, following the crowd. Others are pulling carts and wagons, loaded with whatever possessions they manage to save, trunks of clothing, mattresses, sewing machines, bird cages. Some refuse to let go of items that seem absurdly impractical in the circumstances, clinging to a piano or a heavy piece of furniture, as if letting go would mean accepting that everything is lost. You see a woman dragging a trunk that she can barely move, stopping every few feet to rest. You see an elderly man carrying a framed portrait. You see children wide-eyed and silent, holding tightly to their parents' hands. The destination for many is Golden Gate Park, or the open grounds of the Presidio, a military base at the northern tip of the peninsula. These are areas untouched by fire, where grass and trees offer at least a semblance of safety. By midday, thousands of people have gathered there, spreading out across the lawns and setting up makeshift camps. Some have blankets or tents. Most have nothing but the clothes they are wearing. U.S. Army soldiers are already arriving to distribute what food and water they have available. You find a spot beneath a tree and sit down, your legs trembling with exhaustion. Around you, others do the same. Some are weeping, some are silent, staring at nothing. A few try to organize calling out for family members, asking if anyone has seen so and so, attempting to account for neighbors and friends. The scope of what has happened is only beginning to register. The earthquake itself lasted less than a minute, but the city is burning, and the fires show no sign of stopping. For 3 days, the fires rage. You watch from your refuge as the smoke rises and spreads, as the skyline of downtown San Francisco, its tall office buildings, its grand hotels, its churches is consumed. At night, the glow of the flames lights up the sky in shades of orange and red. The heat is so intense that even from miles away, you can feel it on your skin. The roar of the fire is constant, punctuated by the crash of collapsing structures and the boom of more dynamite. Eventually, the fires reach natural barriers, the bay to the east, areas of open ground to the west, neighborhoods that have been thoroughly cleared by dynamite or that the wind has spared. On April 21st, 3 days after the earthquake, the last major blazes are brought under control. What remains is a landscape of ruin. 490 city blocks have been destroyed, an area covering more than 4 square miles. 80% of San Francisco is gone. The refugee camps swell with the displaced. Estimates suggest that around 200,000 people, more than half the city's pre-earthquake population, have lost their homes. The parks and open squares are filled with tents provided by the U.S. Army, rows upon rows of white canvas stretching in every direction. The Army also sets up communal kitchens, distributing bread, beans, and coffee to the hungry. Latrines are dug. Makeshift hospitals tend to the injured. The scene is orderly in some areas, chaotic in others, but everywhere there is a sense of shared shock and loss. Martial law is declared. Soldiers patrol the streets with orders to shoot looters on sight. Whether these orders are actually carried out is a matter of some debate, but the threat is real and widely understood. The goal is to prevent the lawlessness and violence that city leaders fear could follow such a catastrophe. In practice, most of the refugees are too exhausted, too traumatized, or too busy trying to survive to cause trouble. They wait in line for food. They search for missing family members. They write letters to relatives in other cities, asking for help or simply letting them know they are alive. In the days and weeks that follow, you join the slow procession of people returning to the ruins to search for what can be salvaged. Walking through the burned-out districts is like walking through a strange, lifeless desert of brick and ash. The streets are recognizable only by their layout. Individual buildings have been reduced to walls, chimneys, and piles of rubble. Metal has melted into twisted lumps. Glass has fused into glassy pools. The smell is overwhelming, a mix of charred wood, scorched metal, and something else, something organic and terrible that you try not to think about too closely. You search for your home, or what was your home. It takes time to orient yourself. Without the buildings as landmarks, everything looks the same. Eventually, you find the spot, or think you do. There is nothing left but ashes and fragments of brick. You sift through the debris with your hands, hoping to find something, anything, that survived. A piece of pottery, a coin, a photograph. Often, there is nothing. The fire was so hot that even metal objects have warped beyond recognition. The official death toll will be reported as around 700, though later research suggests it was far higher, likely more than 3,000. Many bodies were never recovered, consumed entirely by the flames, or buried in collapsed buildings that were never fully excavated. Others were buried quickly in mass graves to prevent the spread of disease. The exact number will never be known. What is certain is that thousands of families lost loved ones, and that the grief of the survivors is compounded by the impossibility of proper burial or mourning. As you stand in the ruins, you feel a curious mix of emotions. Grief, certainly. Anger, perhaps, though it is hard to know where to direct it at fate, at the city's corrupt politicians, at the flimsy construction of the buildings that collapsed so easily. But also a strange, numb exhaustion. The disaster is so large, so total, that the mind struggles to grasp it. You have lost your home, your possessions, possibly people you cared about. An entire city, a sophisticated, thriving metropolis, has been reduced to smoking rubble in 72 hours. It feels in some moments almost unreal, like a nightmare from which you might still wake. Yet even in those first terrible days, there are also moments of unexpected kindness. Strangers share food and blankets. Soldiers help the elderly and injured. Relief supplies begin arriving from across the country and around the world. There is a sense, however fragile, that people are trying to hold together, to care for one another, in the face of overwhelming catastrophe. At night, lying on the ground in the refugee camp, you look up at the stars. They are unusually clear and bright, unobscured by the city's lights, which no longer exist. The night is quiet, no cable cars, no wagons, no hum of urban life, just the occasional cough of a nearby sleeper, the rustle of canvas in the breeze, and the distant, fading crackle of embers still burning somewhere in the ruins. You close your eyes and try to sleep. Tomorrow, and the days after, will bring new challenges. Finding shelter, finding work, rebuilding a life from nothing. But for now, there is only exhaustion, and the slow, steady rhythm of your breathing, and the knowledge that you have survived. Segment 2. The Great Refugee Crisis and Recovery. The earthquake has ended. The fires have been extinguished. But the crisis is far from over. Imagine yourself standing in Golden Gate Park a week after the disaster, surrounded by a sea of white tents stretching in every direction. The grass has been trampled into mud. Wooden walkways have been laid between the tent rows to keep people out of the worst muck. Smoke from cooking fires, now permitted in designated areas, drifts across the camp. The smell is a mixture of canvas, wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and the faint, persistent odor of the latrines dug at the camp's edge. You are one of approximately 250,000 people who have lost their homes, more than half of San Francisco's pre-earthquake population. Some have relatives or friends in other parts of the city who can take them in. Others have enough money to leave, boarding trains that will carry them to Los Angeles, to the East Coast, to anywhere that feels safer than this ruined city. But many, perhaps most, have nowhere to go and no resources to get there. The refugee camps become, for a time, entire neighborhoods unto themselves, complete with their own makeshift institutions and social hierarchies. The U.S. Army takes the lead in managing the immediate crisis. Soldiers distribute food from communal kitchens set up throughout the camps: bread, beans, canned goods, coffee. The meals are simple and monotonous, but they are regular and sufficient to keep people alive. At the Presidio alone, some 16,000 refugees depend entirely on the Army for sustenance and shelter. Throughout the various camps, the number is much higher. You stand in line each day, waiting your turn, holding a tin plate or bowl. The soldiers are efficient, handing out portions without much conversation. There is a quiet dignity in the routine, a structure that provides at least a small sense of normalcy amid the chaos. Relief supplies begin arriving almost immediately from across the nation and around the world. Within 10 days of the earthquake, the Red Cross and Mayor's Relief Fund have collected more than $600,000 in donations, an enormous sum in $1,906, equivalent to many millions today. Companies send goods, medical supplies, blankets, clothing, canned food. The Salvation Army sets up its own relief operations, distributing aid and offering spiritual comfort. Johnson & Johnson, the pharmaceutical company, sends a cash contribution of $1,000 and ships emergency medical supplies to San Francisco within 30 hours, despite the enormous logistical challenges. The response is remarkable in its speed and scope, a testament to the shock and sympathy the disaster has inspired nationwide. Yet the distribution of this aid is not always smooth or fair. The Relief Committee, jointly formed by the city and the American Red Cross, controls some $9.5 million in donations. This gives it enormous power over the lives of the refugees. Decisions about who receives what and when are made by officials who are sometimes well-meaning, sometimes incompetent, and sometimes corrupt. You hear rumors, whispered conversations in the tent camp, of relief funds being embezzled, of supplies disappearing before they reach those who need them most. Some of these rumors are true. In the chaotic months after the earthquake, opportunities for graft are plentiful, and not everyone in positions of authority resists the temptation. There is also a less visible issue, the underreporting of casualties. City leaders, eager to encourage investment and rebuilding, downplay the death toll in official statements and press releases. The widely circulated figure of around 700 deaths is almost certainly far too low. Modern researchers, examining records more carefully, estimate that the true number was likely over 3,000, with many victims never officially counted Chinese immigrants, the poor, the transient, those whose bodies were never recovered or buried hastily without documentation. This censorship is driven by economic calculation. San Francisco's leaders fear that if the disaster is seen as too catastrophic, capital will flee, investors will look elsewhere, and the city will never recover its former prominence. So the narrative is carefully shaped. The earthquake was bad, yes, but San Francisco is resilient, and rebuilding is already underway. Insurance becomes another source of frustration and conflict. Many property owners held fire insurance policies, but not earthquake insurance, which was far less common and more expensive. When they file claims, the insurance companies face a difficult question. Was the damage caused by the earthquake or by the fires that followed? If the former, they can deny the claims under earthquake exclusions. If the latter, they must pay. The result is a complex legal and practical battle. Some insurance companies honor their commitments and pay out promptly. Others invoke earthquake exclusions and refuse. Property owners, desperate to recover something, sometimes resort to what might politely be called creative claims, asserting that their buildings survived the earthquake intact and were destroyed only by fire, even when the evidence suggests otherwise. In some cases, this crosses the line into outright fraud. A computer study conducted decades later would suggest that thousands of property owners used fraud and deceit to collect fire insurance claims. The insurers, for their part, are trying to limit their losses in a disaster that threatens to bankrupt some of them entirely. Court cases drag on. One landmark case involves the California Wine Association, which stored millions of gallons of wine in San Francisco warehouses. When fire consumed the buildings, the association filed a claim. The insurer, Commercial Union Fire Insurance Company of New York, denied coverage, arguing that the fire had been caused by the earthquake and thus fell under the policy's earthquake exclusion. The case eventually reached the California Supreme Court, which ruled in favor of the property owner, holding that the fire damage was covered regardless of whether the fire had been directly caused by the earthquake. This decision set important precedents for insurance law, though it came too late to help many claimants who had already settled or given up. For you, as an ordinary working-class refugee, these legal battles are distant abstractions. You did not own property. You rented a room in a tenement. You have no insurance claim to file, no lawyers to hire. Your concern is simpler and more immediate. Finding a place to live, finding work, surviving day to day. The refugee camps are meant to be temporary, but they last for months, and in some cases, for nearly 2 years. The city eventually provides small wooden cottages, bare-bones structures, little more than shacks, but with real walls and roofs, to replace some of the tents. These earthquake cottages become a familiar sight in the parks. They are painted green, with simple gabled roofs and a single door. Inside, there is just enough space for a small stove, a couple of beds, and perhaps a table. Families crowd into them, grateful for the shelter, but acutely aware of how far they have fallen from their pre-earthquake lives. Life in the camps develops its own rhythms. Children play in the open spaces between tents. Women wash clothes in communal areas, hanging them to dry on improvised lines. Men gather to talk, to share news, to speculate about when things will return to normal. Churches and charitable organizations hold services and meetings, trying to maintain a sense of community and moral order. Some refugees find work in the early stages of rebuilding, hauling debris, or assisting with construction. Others struggle to find any employment at all. The economy is in shock, and opportunities are scarce. Slowly, however, the city begins to stir back to life. The decision is made early on. San Francisco will rebuild, and it will rebuild quickly. City officials fear that hesitation will be fatal, but investors and residents will abandon the city if it does not project strength and confidence. There is talk of redesigning the street grid, of widening boulevards, and creating grand civic spaces. But these ambitious plans are largely set aside in favor of speed. The priority is to get buildings up, businesses reopened, and the city functioning again as quickly as possible. Building codes, already lax before the earthquake, are relaxed even further to facilitate rapid construction. Permits are issued with minimal scrutiny. Standards of safety that existed in 1906 are not restored until the 1950s. The result is a building boom of astonishing pace, but questionable quality. By 1909, just 3 years after the disaster, some 20,000 new buildings have been erected. Downtown San Francisco rises again, its skyline gradually filling with new office blocks, hotels, and commercial structures. From a distance, the city begins to look whole again. Up close, if you know where to look, the signs of haste and compromise are evident. For the refugees, the pace of reconstruction is both encouraging and bittersweet. It is good to see the city coming back. It is good to have hope that, eventually, there will be homes and jobs again. But the new city being built is not quite the same as the old one. Many of the elegant Victorian homes and ornate commercial buildings are replaced with simpler, cheaper structures. Some neighborhoods are rebuilt along different lines, with property boundaries redrawn and old communities scattered. And the underlying vulnerability, the fact that the city still sits on unstable ground, astride one of the world's most active fault lines, is largely ignored in the rush to rebuild. You notice, too, that not everyone is treated equally in the recovery. Wealthy neighborhoods like Nob Hill and Pacific Heights, where the city's elite lived, are rebuilt relatively quickly and with higher quality materials. Working-class areas like the south of Market, where you lived, are slower to recover. Some lots remain empty for years. Some residents never return, finding new lives elsewhere or simply unable to afford the cost of starting over. Chinatown, the densest and most vulnerable neighborhood before the earthquake, faces particular challenges. There are efforts by some city leaders to relocate the Chinese community entirely, to use the disaster as an opportunity to clean up the area and redevelop it for other purposes. These efforts ultimately fail, in part due to resistance from the Chinese community, and in part due to economic realities, but they reveal the extent to which the recovery process is shaped by existing power structures and prejudices. As the months pass, the camps gradually empty. Families move into new apartments, or into the earthquake cottages that have been relocated from the parks to vacant lots, or they leave the city entirely. You eventually find a small room in a newly built boarding house. It is not much, the walls are thin, the windows rattle, and the building was clearly thrown up in a hurry, but it is a roof over your head, and after months of living in a tent, it feels almost luxurious. You return to work, or find new work, and begin the slow process of rebuilding a life from scratch. There is a strange, unsettled quality to the city during these years. On one level, things are returning to normal. Cable cars run again. Businesses reopen. The streets fill with traffic and noise. But beneath the surface, the trauma lingers. Many people suffer from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress nightmares, anxiety, an inability to feel safe indoors, a tendency to startle at sudden noises. The earthquake and fire have left invisible scars that do not heal as quickly as the physical landscape. Yet there is also resilience, and even a kind of defiant pride. San Francisco has been knocked down, but it has not been knocked out. The speed of the rebuilding, whatever its flaws, is a testament to the determination of the city's residents and leaders. Within a decade, San Francisco will host the Panama Pacific International Exposition, a grand World's Fair designed to showcase the city's recovery and to celebrate the completion of the Panama Canal. The exposition is a success, drawing millions of visitors and declaring to the world that San Francisco is back. As you lie in your new room at night, you think sometimes about all that has been lost. The city you knew before April 18, 1906, is gone. Friends and neighbors are scattered or dead. Familiar buildings and streets exist only in memory. But you have survived. The city has survived. And in the quiet moments before sleep, you find a kind of peace in that simple fact. The ground may shake again someday. Everyone knows that. But for now, there is rest and the slow, steady work of rebuilding. The refugee camps in the parks are eventually dismantled. The tents are taken down, the wooden cottages moved or sold. Grass grows back over the trampled ground. If you visit Golden Gate Park a few years later, you might find it hard to believe that thousands of people once lived there, huddled together in the aftermath of catastrophe. The park has returned to its intended purpose, a place of leisure and beauty where families picnic and children play. The emergency has passed. Life goes on. As you settle into your rebuilt life, walking the reconstructed streets of San Francisco, you might occasionally wonder why the earth moved as it did. What force could cause such destruction? Why did some neighborhoods suffer far more than others, even when they were the same distance from the fault? And most pressing of all, could it happen again? In 1906, the answers to these questions were far from clear. Earthquakes had been recorded and studied for centuries, but the mechanisms behind them remained poorly understood. The San Francisco disaster would change that. It would become, in effect, a natural laboratory, a catastrophe that, through careful study, would lay the foundations of modern seismology and earthquake science. Imagine a geologist walking the fault line in the months after the earthquake, measuring, photographing, taking notes. His name is Harry Fielding Reid, a professor at Johns Hopkins University, and he has been assigned to investigate the earthquake's causes as part of a commission established by California's governor. Reid is methodical and patient. He examines fence lines that have been offset, roads that have been torn apart, and property boundaries that no longer align. He compares photographs and survey measurements taken before the earthquake with new observations made afterward. What Reid discovers is striking. Along a line running roughly northwest to southeast for some 296 miles, from San Juan Bautista in the south to Cape Mendocino in the north, the ground surface has been displaced horizontally. In some places, the offset is modest, a few feet. In others, particularly near Point Reyes north of San Francisco, the displacement is as much as 20 feet. Fences that once ran in straight lines now have sharp kinks in them. Roads are torn apart, with one side shifted dramatically to the north or south relative to the other. This pattern of movement is not what many had expected. There is no vertical upheaval of mountains, no great crater or chasm. Instead, the motion is primarily horizontal, what geologists would later call strike-slip movement. The western side of the fault has moved northward relative to the eastern side, as if some immense force had pulled the two sides of California in opposite directions until something gave way. Reed studies survey data that had been collected in the decades before the earthquake measurements of the precise positions of landmarks and survey markers across the region. When he compares these old measurements to new ones taken after the quake, he notices something remarkable. The ground had been deforming gradually over many years before the earthquake, bending and straining slowly, like a stick being bent a little more each year. Markers on opposite sides of the fault had been moving relative to each other at a steady, slow rate about 3.2 meters over 50 years. From these observations, Reed develops what he calls the elastic rebound theory. The idea is elegant, and in retrospect seems almost obvious, though at the time it represented a major breakthrough. Reed proposes that the rocks on either side of the fault are being pushed by distant tectonic forces that would not be fully understood until the theory of plate tectonics emerged decades later. These forces cause the rocks to bend and strain gradually, storing elastic energy much like a stretched rubber band. For years, decades, or even centuries, the rocks accumulate this strain, deforming slowly but not breaking. Eventually, however, the stress becomes too great. The rocks cannot bend any further. The fault ruptures suddenly, and the stored elastic energy is released in an instant, snapping the rocks back toward their original, unstrained shape, the elastic rebound. Imagine it yourself, as Reed might have explained it. Picture holding a straight stick in both hands and slowly bending it. For a time, the stick flexes, storing energy. Then, with a sharp crack, it breaks, and the two halves snap back. The 1906 earthquake, Reed concludes, was that moment of breaking, that sudden release of decades of accumulated strain. This theory provides, for the first time, a clear mechanical explanation for earthquakes. It shows that they are not random acts of divine wrath or mysterious underground explosions, but the result of understandable physical processes. The Earth's crust is not rigid and unchanging. It is constantly moving and deforming, and earthquakes are simply the way that movement is accommodated when the stress becomes too great. Reed's work, published in 1911, becomes a cornerstone of seismology and remains the accepted explanation for earthquakes to this day. But Reed's investigation reveals more than just a theory. It also identifies, in unprecedented detail, the fault itself, the San Andreas Fault, which runs along much of California's length. Before 1906, this fault was known to exist, but its extent and behavior were not well understood. The 1906 earthquake provides a dramatic demonstration of its activity. The surface rupture visible as a long scar across the landscape allows scientists to trace the fault's path and to understand that it represents a major boundary in the Earth's crust. The earthquake also reveals troubling patterns about where the shaking was most intense. Imagine being a researcher examining damage reports from across the city. You notice that some areas, built on solid bedrock, sustained relatively little damage despite being close to the fault. Other areas, particularly those built on filled landformer marshes and tidal flats that had been covered with soil and debris to create new building sites, suffered devastation even when they were further from the fault. The correlation is clear and consistent. Areas underlain by soft sediments, especially bay mud, the fine-grained clay, and silt that accumulates on bay floors, experienced far stronger shaking than areas on firm rock. The reason has to do with how seismic waves travel through different materials. Solid rock transmits the waves efficiently, but soft sediment amplifies them, causing the ground to shake more violently and for a longer duration. In some areas, the saturated sediment even liquefied, losing its strength entirely and causing buildings to sink or tilt. This observation leads to the development of what is now called seismic zonation, the practice of mapping areas according to their earthquake hazard based on underlying geology. The 1908 report by Andrew Lawson, which compiles the scientific findings from the earthquake, emphasizes this correlation between geology and damage intensity, laying the groundwork for future building codes and land use planning. Yet, as with many lessons learned from disaster, the practical application is slow and incomplete. The warnings are there, plainly visible in the data. San Francisco is built on unstable ground. Large portions of the city sit on fill soil dumped into shallow waters to expand the available land. These areas are particularly vulnerable. Building codes should be strengthened. Certain areas should perhaps not be built on at all, or should require special engineering measures. Yet the city's leaders, eager to rebuild quickly and reluctant to impose restrictions that might slow economic recovery, largely ignore these recommendations. There is, too, a kind of willful denial about the earthquake risk itself. City boosters, intent on restoring San Francisco's reputation and attracting investment, downplay the likelihood of future earthquakes. They emphasize the fire, which can happen anywhere, rather than the earthquake, which is specific to the region. This framing serves a purpose. It makes the disaster seem less threatening, less unique to San Francisco. It allows the city to present itself as no more dangerous than Chicago, which burned in 1871, or any other major city that has faced fire. But it is, of course, a deception, one that leaves future generations vulnerable to the same hazards. The development of the modified Mercalli intensity scale, which measures the intensity of shaking based on observed effects rather than on the earthquake's magnitude, also emerges from careful study of the 1906 event. This scale allows scientists to create detailed maps of shaking intensity across a region, helping to identify patterns and to understand how earthquakes affect different areas. The highest intensities recorded during the 1906 earthquake reaching level Xi, described as extreme, occurred in San Francisco and in areas like Santa Rosa to the north, where the destruction was nearly total. As you lie in bed at night, considering these discoveries, you might find a strange comfort in the knowledge that science is slowly making sense of what happened. The earthquake was not a punishment or a mystery, but the result of natural forces that can be studied, measured, and to some extent predicted. Yet there is also an unsettling reality. Those same forces are still at work. The San Andreas Fault did not cease to exist in 1906. It continues to accumulate strain, bending and deforming the landscape year by year, storing energy that will, someday, be released in another great earthquake. The question is not if, but when, and whether the lessons learned from 1906 about building codes, about the dangers of construction on soft ground, about the need for preparedness will be heeded, or whether future generations will have to relearn them at terrible cost. For now, in the quiet years after the disaster, the fault rests. The ground is still. San Francisco grows and prospers, its new buildings rising confidently on the same unstable land. You walk the streets and see no trace of the danger beneath. The city feels solid, permanent, safe. But somewhere deep below, the rocks are bending again, slowly, invisibly, accumulating the strain that will one day have to be released. The scientists have provided the knowledge. Whether society will use it is another question entirely. As you drift towards sleep, the technical details of elastic rebound and seismic waves fade into a kind of abstract hum. What remains is a simple understanding. The earth moves. It always has. It always will. And we, living on its surface, must find ways to adapt, to build wisely, to prepare. The 1906 earthquake taught those lessons. Whether they were learned is a question history continues to answer. For tonight, though, the ground is still. The city sleeps. And so can you, held gently by the present moment, where nothing is shaking, nothing is falling, and the only motion is the steady rise and fall of your own breathing. Segment 4. Gilded Age San Francisco, the city that was. Imagine waking in the same city a year earlier, in the spring of 1905. The air is cool and damp, the kind of morning mist that softens the edges of buildings and makes street lamps glow faintly, even after sunrise. You step outside into the San Francisco of the Gilded Age, a city that calls itself proudly the Paris of the West. The streets are alive with the clanging of cable car bells, the clip-clop of horses, and the hum of conversation in a dozen languages. There is no sense, yet, of imminent catastrophe. Only confidence. Downtown, along Market Street, the heart of the business district pulses with energy. Streetcars glide past rows of impressive stone and brick buildings. Banks, insurance companies, newspaper offices, all standing shoulder to shoulder in solid, self-assured lines. At the corner of Market and New Montgomery Streets stands one of the city's greatest symbols of prosperity, the Palace Hotel. When it opened in 1875, this 7-story structure was the largest hotel in the western United States, boasting 755 guest rooms, each with its own private bathroom, an extraordinary luxury at the time. Its vast central court, covered by a glass roof, serves as an indoor garden and social space where wealthy guests stroll among palms and fountains, taking tea or conducting business in an atmosphere of refined comfort. The Palace is more than a hotel. It is a statement. It announces that San Francisco has joined the ranks of the world's great cities. Politicians, railroad magnates, bankers, and visiting dignitaries stay there, their presence reinforcing the city's importance as a financial center. The building is solid, ornate, and seemingly permanent, a place where one might imagine the future unfolding in endless banquets and negotiations under its grand chandeliers. To the north and west, the hills rise, topped by the mansions of Nob Hill. Here live some of the men whose wealth helped build the yawl, railroad and mining empires of the American West figures, like Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, and other railroad and mining millionaires. Their homes are elaborate Victorian palaces, bristling with turrets, verandas, and carved ornament, each one an attempt to outshine its neighbors. Inside, there are ballrooms, conservatories, imported tapestries, and art collected from Europe and Asia. From their windows, these families look out over the city and the bay, watching ships arrive from around the world. Down the slopes, in the bustling streets of Chinatown, the atmosphere is different, but no less vibrant. San Francisco's Chinatown is the oldest in North America and one of the largest Chinese enclaves outside Asia. Its narrow streets and alleys are lined with shops, tea houses, herbalists, temples, and family associations. Signs in Chinese characters hang from balconies. Lanterns sway above the road. Vendors sell vegetables, dried fish, and delicacies unfamiliar to many white San Franciscans. For Chinese immigrants and their descendants, this is a place of community in a city that often treats them with suspicion or hostility. Chinatown is also exoticized by outsiders. Some come as tourists, seeking a carefully curated experience of Oriental mystery and charm. Others come as moral reformers, convinced that the neighborhood is a den of vice gambling, opium, prostitution. City health officials and politicians periodically suggest clearing it away, relocating its residents to the outskirts to make room for more respectable development. Yet the community endures, anchored by institutions like the Chinese Six Companies, which negotiate with city authorities and defend the neighborhood's right to exist. San Francisco's cultural life thrives in this period. The city boasts opera houses, theaters, music halls, and restaurants that attract visitors from across the West. Elegant venues host performances of European opera and classical music. Smaller theaters offer melodramas, vaudeville shows, and comedic sketches. Restaurants serve French cuisine, American steaks, and seafood fresh from the bay. There is a sense that almost anything can be found here if one knows where to look. The city's wealth comes from many sources. The original gold rush of 1849 has long passed, but its legacy remains in the fortunes made from mining and the businesses that served the miners. Silver from the Comstock lode in Nevada has poured money into San Francisco banks. The city's position as a major Pacific port makes it a hub for trade with Asia and Latin America. Railroads connect it to the rest of the United States, making it a gateway for goods and people moving between East and West. The result is a booming economy, with jobs in shipping, manufacturing, construction, and finance. Yet beneath this prosperity lies a layer of corruption that is widely recognized, even if seldom confronted. At the center of this system stands Abraham Roof, a political boss, and Eugene Schmitz, the city's mayor. Schmitz, a former musician, has been elected on a labor ticket, but his administration quickly becomes synonymous with graft and extortion. Roof, operating behind the scenes, controls appointments and contracts, ensuring that businesses seeking favorable treatment pay for the privilege. Bribery becomes a routine part of civic life. Owners of French restaurants, establishments that often provide discreet spaces for gambling and prostitution pay protection money to keep their licenses and avoid police raids. Public contracts are steered toward favored companies. City departments are filled with Roof supporters. Ordinary citizens grumble, but many accept this as simply the way things are. The city's rapid growth, its fortunes made and lost, seem to invite this kind of opportunism. In the working-class districts, including the south of Market, where you lived in our earlier imagining, life is much more precarious. Tenement buildings are crammed with families, single laborers, and recent immigrants. The structures are often cheaply built, with little attention to safety or sanitation. Rents are high relative to wages. Yet the proximity to factories, docks, and rail yards makes these neighborhoods convenient for those who depend on daily work. Children play in the streets. Laundry hangs from lines between buildings. The sense of community is strong, even as conditions are harsh. Architecturally, San Francisco is a city of wood and ornament. Entire neighborhoods are filled with wooden Victorian houses, some modest, some extravagantly decorated with carved brackets, bay windows, and intricate trim. These buildings are charming, even beautiful, but they are also highly flammable. The same features that make them visually appealing, their balconies, their closely spaced facades, their decorative details, can help fire spread rapidly from one structure to the next. Few people dwell on this danger. Fire is a familiar threat in any 19th century city, but modern fire departments and insurance companies are seen as adequate protection. All of this, the wealth and the poverty, the culture and the corruption, the beauty and the vulnerability, coexists in a kind of dynamic equilibrium. San Francisco believes in its future. City boosters promote it as the premier metropolis of the Pacific Coast, a place where fortunes can be made and pleasures enjoyed. The idea that the entire city could be nearly erased in 3 days feels unimaginable. And yet, that is precisely what will happen. When the earthquake strikes in 1906, the Palace Hotel, symbol of luxury and stability, survives the shaking but not the fire. The building burns and is reduced to a shell. Its ruins stand as a haunting reminder that even the grandest structures are fragile. The mansions of Nob Hill are similarly destroyed, their opulent interiors consumed in the firestorm. Chinatown is devastated, its tightly packed buildings proving especially vulnerable to both quake and flames. City leaders see an opportunity to relocate the Chinese community, but Chinese merchants and leaders like Luk Tin Eli resist, ultimately winning the right to rebuild on the same site with new, more fireproof buildings that adopt a stylized Oriental architectural language to attract tourists. The Schmitz Roof political machine does not survive the post-earthquake years intact. Investigations into graft and corruption, already brewing before 1906, gain momentum afterward. Schmitz is eventually convicted of extortion in 1907, though his conviction is later overturned on technical grounds. His political career, however, is effectively ended. Roof is convicted and imprisoned. The earthquake, in a way, helps bring about a political reckoning as public tolerance for corruption dwindles in the face of the enormous task of rebuilding. As the city reconstructs itself, it regains much of its economic strength, but something of its pre-quake character is gone. The ornate Victorian skyline is thin. The Palace Hotel will be rebuilt and reopened in 1909, again a symbol of luxury. But it is a new building, not the one that stood before. Chinatown will rise again, more consciously shaped as a tourist destination. New commercial blocks downtown will reflect early 20th century architectural taste, simpler, more vertical, less elaborately decorated. San Francisco remains a major city, but those who knew it before 1906 often say that it never quite recaptures the particular elegance and atmosphere it once had. If you walk through the city decades later, you might pass buildings that occupy the same lots as their predecessors, yet the continuity is deceptive. Under your feet, the ground is different-filled land compacted by shaking rubble buried beneath new foundations. In the minds of older residents, memories of the pre-quake city linger like a faint overlay. A theater that once stood here, a restaurant that once served oysters and champagne there, a mansion that crowned that now empty slope. The Paris of the West remains in stories, photographs, and postcards, even as a new San Francisco lives its own life above those shadows. You have now moved, in imagination, through the full arc of this story. You have felt the sudden violence of the earthquake in those first 45 to 60 seconds of shaking. You have walked through burning streets, joined the flow of refugees to Golden Gate Park and the Presidio, and lived in tent cities that housed 200,000 homeless people under Army supervision. You have watched the relief efforts struggle with questions of fairness, corruption, and insurance, seen the city rebuild with astonishing speed, and understood how science used this disaster to unlock the mechanics of the San Andreas Fault and the theory of elastic rebound. And you have wandered, gently, through the vanished Gilded Age city, the Palace Hotel with its 755 rooms, Chinatown with its complex mix of prejudice and resilience, and the Ruf Schmidt's political machine that thrived in the shadows. Set against your own present, the contrast is soothing. You lie now in a bed that does not shake. The walls around you are intact. Fire is controlled by switches and standards that did not exist in 1906. If disaster strikes in your time, there are emergency systems, scientific monitoring, and far more robust building codes in many places, however imperfect they may be. The people of early 20th century San Francisco had none of these advantages. They faced the Earth's movement with little warning and less understanding, and yet they endured. Their losses were immense, more than 3,000 lives, 80% of the city's buildings, nearly 500,000 people displaced, and then resettled in a remarkably short span. But even in that shattered landscape, there were threads of continuity. Families staying together, neighbors helping one another, communities like Chinatown insisting on their right to exist, scientists carefully measuring and thinking, and ordinary workers rebuilding streets, houses, and workplaces, one brick, one beam, one pipe at a time. As these images drift through your mind, you can let them become softer, less defined, like an old photograph gently fading at the edges. The roaring firestorms, the crowded camps, the rumbling fault lines, all recede into the background of history. What remains in the foreground is quiet, the simple fact that you are here, now breathing steadily, in a room that is not on fire, in a city that is not, at this moment, in ruins. You might imagine, just for a moment, walking once more along Market Street before the quake. The sun is setting, casting a warm glow on the Palace Hotel's facade. Cable cars rattle past. Shop windows are lit. People hurry home or linger in doorways to talk. You feel the solid pavement under your feet, hear the ordinary sounds of a city at peace. Then you let that scene dissolve, knowing that it belongs to another time, another world. Your own world, in this moment, is much smaller and simpler. It is the space of your bed, the feel of your pillow, the rhythm of your breath. The stories of 1906 have done their work. They have carried your mind through distant streets and distant years, giving it a gentle path to follow until it grows tired. You do not need to remember every fact or every name. You can let them go. If your eyes are open, you may let them close. If they are already closed, you can simply notice the darkness behind your eyelids and the comfort of being still. The ground beneath you is quiet. The city around you, whatever its size or shape, is largely asleep. The people of San Francisco in 1906 faced their catastrophe with the tools they had. You face the night with the simple gift of safety, here and now. And as you drift further toward sleep, the last echoes of cable car bells and distant fire alarms fade away, leaving only the soft hush of the present.